In the annals of ancient history, few deaths capture the cruel irony of fate, quite like that of Mithridates VI, the poison king of Pontus. Picture this, a man who spent decades building immunity to every known toxin, preparing for the very method of assassination that had claimed his father's life, only to find himself trapped by his own careful preparations. When death became his only escape, the year was 63 BC, and in a citadel overlooking the Black Sea, one of Rome's most formidable enemies would face an end more twisted than any torture chamber could devise. What makes Mithridates' death truly horrifying isn't just the physical agony, it's the psychological torment of a man betrayed by his own genius. Here was a king who had turned his body into a living laboratory, who had methodically transformed himself into something approaching immortality, only to discover that immortality becomes a curse when life becomes unbearable. The very immunity that had protected him for decades would become his final enemy, trapping him in a desperate struggle between his desire to die and his body's refusal to comply. The tale of Mithridates VI represents one of history's most chilling examples of unintended consequences. His obsession with cheating death through poison immunity, a practice now known as Mithridatism, was born from rational fear and methodical planning. Yet this same obsession would ultimately deny him the dignity of choosing his own end. In his final moments, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by his own children, Mithridates would learn that sometimes the greatest horror isn't death itself, but the inability to die when death becomes the only mercy left. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we must journey back to the courts of ancient Pontus, where poison flowed as freely as wine, and where a young prince learned that survival meant embracing the very substances that could destroy him. This is not merely a story of political defeat or military failure. This is the account of a man who literally poisoned himself to stay alive, only to discover that he had created his own inescapable prison. The king who feared poison above all else would find his death delayed by the very toxins he had spent a lifetime conquering. The ancient world was no stranger to cruel deaths and elaborate tortures, but the end of Mithridates VI stands apart for its unique psychological horror. Here was suffering, born not from external torture devices or creative cruelty, but from the inexorable logic of the king's own choices. Every dose of poison he had taken to protect his life had stolen away his ability to end it peacefully. The man who had made himself immune to death by poison had also made himself immune to death by poison, a distinction that would prove more important than he could ever have imagined. Modern audiences might struggle to comprehend the level of paranoia that drove Mithridates to such extremes, but in the cutthroat world of ancient politics, his fears were entirely justified. Royal courts were chambers of whispered plots and sudden deaths, where a king's survival often depended on his ability to detect and counter the schemes of those closest to him. Mithridates had chosen the path of scientific preparation over political maneuvering, turning his body into a fortress against assassination. But fortresses, as he would learn, can become prisons when circumstances change. The story of Mithridates VI's death forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of control, survival, and the price of security. In our modern world, where we take elaborate precautions against every conceivable threat, there's something deeply unsettling about a man who prepared so thoroughly for danger that he lost the ability to escape it. His death represents the ultimate failure of human planning, not because his preparations didn't work, but because they worked too well. The kingdom of Pontus in the 1st century BC was a realm where political survival required constant vigilance and creative thinking. Located along the southern shores of the Black Sea in what is now northern Turkey, Pontus sat at the crossroads of East and West, inheriting the political intrigue of Persian courts and the military ambitions of Greek kingdoms. It was a land where rulers lived and died by their ability to navigate treacherous political waters, and where the price of weakness was swift and violent death. Into this world was born Mithridates VI, a prince who would transform paranoia into a science and survival into an art form, the political landscape of Mithridates. Youth was shaped by the expanding shadow of Roman power. Rome had spent centuries systematically dismantling the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great, and by the time Mithridates came of age, it was clear that accommodation with Roman authority was no longer sufficient for survival. The traditional Hellenistic kingdoms were falling one by one, their rulers either co-opted as client kings or eliminated entirely. For a young monarch with ambitions beyond mere survival, the choice was stark: submit to Rome or prepare for war. Mithridates chose war, but he understood that military conflict was only one dimension of the struggle ahead. The assassination of Mithridates V in 120 BC had demonstrated with brutal clarity that even kings were vulnerable to the most intimate forms of betrayal. Poison had been the weapon of choice, silent, untraceable, and perfectly suited to the closed world of court politics. The murder had occurred at a banquet among friends and family, transforming the most basic act of hospitality into an instrument of death. For the young Mithridates VI, his father's assassination became a defining trauma that would shape every aspect of his approach to power. He would never again allow himself to be vulnerable to such intimate treachery. The royal court of Pontus was a microcosm of the dangers that faced any ambitious ruler in the ancient world. Succession was rarely smooth. Family loyalty was often subordinated to political calculation, and alliances could shift overnight based on changing circumstances. Mithridates' own mother, Mithridates VI, had initially favored his younger brother for the throne, forcing the young prince to flee into the wilderness to escape her menaces. This experience of betrayal within his own family reinforced the lessons learned from his father's death. Trust was a luxury he could not afford, and survival required constant preparation for betrayal from any quarter. The cultural context of Mithridates' obsession with poison immunity was rooted in both Persian and Greek traditions of pharmacological knowledge. The royal courts of the ancient world had long been centers of medical and toxicological research, partly driven by the practical needs of rulers who faced constant assassination attempts. Persian kings in particular were known for their sophisticated understanding of poisons and antidotes, viewing toxicology as an essential royal science. Mithridates was drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge when he began his systematic program of self-immunization, but he would take these traditions far beyond anything attempted by his predecessors. The social and economic foundations of Pontus provided Mithridates with the resources necessary to pursue his ambitious program of poison immunity. The kingdom controlled lucrative trade routes and possessed rich natural resources, including access to many of the exotic plants and substances needed for his experiments. More importantly, Pontus was home to diverse populations with their own traditions of herbal knowledge and folk medicine. Mithridates systematically collected this knowledge, bringing together Greek scientific methodology, Persian royal traditions, and local folk wisdom to create an unprecedented program of toxicological research. The philosophical underpinnings of Mithridates' approach to poison immunity reflected the broader intellectual currents of his era. This was a time when the boundaries between medicine, magic, and science were fluid, and when ambitious rulers saw the systematic application of knowledge as a form of power. Mithridates viewed his body as a kingdom to be defended through careful preparation and scientific method. His daily consumption of antidotes and gradual exposure to increasing doses of various poisons, represented a form of pharmaceutical kingship, the idea that a ruler's body itself could be transformed into a tool of statecraft and survival, the daily routine that would ultimately seal Mithridates' fate began each morning with a ritual as methodical as any religious observance in the private chambers of his palace, attended only by his most trusted advisors and the Scythian shamans. Known as the Agori, the king would consume a carefully prepared mixture of herbs, minerals, and organic compounds designed to strengthen his body's resistance to poison. This was no simple folk remedy but a complex pharmaceutical preparation based on systematic experimentation and refined through decades of testing. Each ingredient had been selected for its specific properties, and the proportions had been adjusted based on careful observation of their effects on both willing subjects and condemned prisoners. The king's collection of antidotes represented one of the most sophisticated pharmacological programs in the ancient world. According to historical sources, his universal antidote contained more than 50 different ingredients, ranging from common herbs like rue and anise to exotic substances like Pontic honey, various venoms, and even powdered precious stones. The preparation was ground into a fine powder and mixed with honey to create almond-sized tablets that Mithridates consumed daily. But this was only the foundation of his program. He also regularly ingested small quantities of known poisons, gradually increasing the doses to build tolerance through controlled exposure. The testing phase of Mithridates' poison immunity program reveals the darker aspects of his scientific methodology. The king maintained a supply of condemned criminals who served as unwilling test subjects for his experiments. New compounds were first tested on these prisoners to determine their effects and establish safe dosage levels. Those who survived the initial tests might be used for further experiments, while those who died provided valuable data about lethal doses and symptoms. This systematic use of human test subjects reflects both the ruthless pragmatism of ancient rulers and the primitive state of medical ethics in the classical world. The physical effects of Mithridates' daily poison consumption would have been both subtle and profound. His body gradually adapted to substances that would have killed ordinary men, developing enhanced liver function and altered metabolic processes. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of unusual physical vitality and strength, though whether this was due to his pharmaceutical regimen or simply good genetics remains unclear. What is certain is that his appearance and demeanor would have been affected by the constant chemical stress his body endured. The daily consumption of sublethal doses of various toxins would have required extraordinary physical resilience and created a unique physiological profile. The psychological dimensions of Mithridates' poison immunity program were perhaps more significant than the physical ones. The daily ritual of consuming potentially deadly substances required enormous mental discipline and represented a form of controlled self-destruction in service of ultimate survival. Each morning brought a renewed confrontation with mortality as the king deliberately ingested compounds that could kill him if he miscalculated the dose or timing. This created a unique psychological relationship with death. Familiarity bred not contempt but a complex form of mastery that would prove tragically relevant in his final moments. The broader implications of Mithridates' program extended far beyond personal protection. By demonstrating immunity to poison, he projected an image of supernatural power that served important political functions. Enemies would be discouraged from attempting assassination by poison, knowing that such attempts would likely fail and reveal their treachery. Allies would be impressed by his apparent invulnerability, seeing it as evidence of divine favor or superior wisdom. The king's immunity to poison became part of his political persona, enhancing his reputation for cunning and careful preparation while simultaneously warning potential enemies of the futility of conventional assassination attempts. The scientific legacy of Mithridates' experiments would outlive both the king and his kingdom. Ancient physicians like Galen would study his methods and attempt to recreate his universal antidote, leading to the development of compounds called Mithridatium that remained popular for centuries. The principle of building immunity through controlled exposure, now known as Mithridatism, would influence medical thinking for generations. Even today, the concept underlies certain approaches to toxicology and immunology, though modern practitioners have the benefit of scientific understanding that was unavailable to the ancient king. The historical record of Mithridates' final days comes to us primarily through the writings of ancient historians like Ion, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch, who drew on contemporary accounts and official Roman records. These sources, while not always in complete agreement on specific details, provide a remarkably consistent picture of the events leading to the king's death. According to Ion's Roman history, the most detailed account we possess, Mithridates had been driven to the citadel of Panticapam, modern-day Kerch in Crimea, by a rebellion led by his own son, Pharnaces II, who had allied himself with Roman forces and local nobles, grown weary of their king's increasingly desperate military preparations. The rebellion against Mithridates had been brewing for months. As the aging king's plans for a final campaign against Rome grew more extreme, and his demands on the local population more burdensome, Pharnaces II, calculating that his father's cause was lost and that accommodation with Rome offered better prospects for the survival of the dynasty, had secretly negotiated with Pompey's representatives. When the younger prince openly declared his rebellion, many of Mithridates' remaining supporters, including Roman exiles who had formed the core of his army, abandoned their aging leader. The speed of this collapse left Mithridates with only a handful of loyal guards and his two youngest daughters in the isolated citadel. Contemporary accounts describe Mithridates in his final days as a man consumed by desperate fury and bitter disappointment. Plutarch notes that the king paced constantly, unable to sleep, alternately raging against the ingratitude of his subjects and the treachery of his son. The man who had once commanded vast armies and controlled trade routes spanning the Black Sea now found himself reduced to plotting impossible escapes and contemplating increasingly extreme measures. His physical appearance had deteriorated significantly. Accounts describe him as gaunt and aged beyond his years. His famous physical strength, sapped by decades of stress and the constant chemical burden of his poison immunity program. The decision to end his own life appears to have been reached after Mithridates received definitive word that Pompey's forces were closing in and that no relief was possible. According to Cassius Dio, the king understood that capture would mean being paraded through Rome in chains as part of Pompey's triumph, a fate he considered worse than death. This was not an impulsive decision born of momentary despair, but a calculated choice by a man who had always preferred to control his own destiny. The irony that his carefully constructed defenses would now become obstacles to his chosen escape was not yet apparent to him. The preparations for suicide began with Mithridates ensuring that his daughters would not suffer the humiliation of Roman captivity. Both young women, reportedly named Mithridates and Nyssa, had been betrothed to foreign kings and represented valuable political assets to Rome. According to Ion's account, they actually requested to drink the poison first, understanding that their fate as prisoners would likely involve sexual slavery or forced marriage to Roman nobles. The king's decision to honor their request demonstrates both his affection for his daughters and his recognition that death was preferable to the degradation that awaited them as captives. The poison Mithridates had chosen for their final escape was kept in a compartment hidden in the hilt of his sword, a deadly compound that he had reserved specifically for this purpose. And like his daily antidotes, this substance was designed to be rapidly fatal, bypassing the body's natural defenses through sheer concentration and toxicity. The king had carried this final solution with him for years, understanding that there might come a time when his immunity to conventional poisons would require a more extreme approach. The fact that he had felt compelled to maintain such a backup plan suggests that even at the height of his confidence in his immunity program, some part of him had recognized its potential limitations. The scene, as described by ancient historians, has a terrible intimacy that makes it more horrifying than any public execution. Here was a man who had devoted his life to protecting himself and his family from poison, now administering that same substance to his daughters and himself in a desperate attempt to escape an even worse fate. The trust his daughters placed in him, requesting the poison first and drinking it without hesitation, speaks to the genuine bonds of affection that persisted even in this moment of ultimate despair. Yet within minutes, that same trust would be revealed as tragically misplaced as the king discovered that his own preparations had trapped him in a nightmare of his own making. The moment when Mithridates realized his suicide attempt had failed represents one of the most psychologically devastating scenes recorded in ancient literature. According to Ion's detailed account, the king watched in horror as his daughters quickly succumbed to the poison while he remained standing, feeling only mild nausea and discomfort. The substance that had killed his children within minutes had no more effect on him than the countless doses he had taken during his immunity training. For a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this contingency, the failure of his final escape plan must have been devastating beyond imagination. The king's immediate response was to attempt to accelerate the poison's effects through physical exertion. Cassius Dio reports that Mithridates began pacing rapidly around the chamber, hoping that increased circulation might help the toxin reach vital organs more quickly. When this proved ineffective, he tried jumping and running, desperate to force his body to process the poison more efficiently. The sight of the once mighty king reduced to frantically exercising in his final chamber, surrounded by the bodies of his daughters, represents a peculiarly modern form of horror, the failure of technology and preparation when they are most needed. As minutes turned to hours and the poison continued to have minimal effect, Mithridates began to understand the full scope of his predicament. The very immunity that had protected him from countless assassination attempts was now preventing him from choosing the manner of his own death. Every dose of antidote he had taken, every gradual exposure to toxins, every careful preparation that had kept him alive was now conspiring to keep him alive when he most wanted to die. The king, who had made himself immune to poison, had also made himself immune to escape through poison, a distinction that would prove cruelly significant. The psychological torment of these hours cannot be understated. Mithridates was not simply facing death. He was facing the complete failure of his life's work. The scientific methodology that had been his pride and his protection had become his prison. Worse still, his failure was not due to external enemies or superior force, but to the inexorable logic of his own choices. Every rational decision he had made to protect himself had contributed to this moment of absolute helplessness. The man who had prided himself on controlling every variable had discovered a variable he had not considered. When it became clear that the poison would not work, Mithridates attempted to end his life with his sword. But here too, his preparations betrayed him. According to Cassius Dio, the combined effects of age, stress, and whatever toxins had managed to enter his system had left him too weak to deliver a fatal blow. His hand shook as he tried to drive the blade into his chest, and when the attempt failed to penetrate deeply enough, he lacked the strength for a second try. The king, who had once been renowned for his physical prowess, found himself unable to perform even this final act of self-determination. The arrival of the soldiers sent to pursue his rebellious son marked the beginning of the end. Finding Mithridates still alive but clearly attempting suicide, they faced a dilemma of their own. Roman tradition held that great enemies deserved honorable treatment, and there was something deeply disturbing about watching the famous Poison King suffer through his failed attempt at self-destruction. According to Ion, it was at this point that Mithridates made his final request, asking his GIC bodyguard, Mithridates, to end his suffering with a sword thrust. The fact that he had to ask for help to die represents perhaps the ultimate humiliation for a man who had spent his life ensuring he would never be dependent on others for his survival. The actual moment of death, when it finally came, was anticlimactic compared to the hours of psychological torment that preceded it. Mithridates, moved by loyalty or pity, granted his master's request with a quick thrust to the heart. But even this final act carried a note of cruel irony. Mithridates died, not by his own hand, not by the poison he had carried for years, but by the sort of a subordinate who had to be asked to perform the deed. The man who had spent decades preparing for every possible death had died in a manner he had never anticipated, requiring assistance for an act he had assumed he could always perform alone. The immediate aftermath of Mithridates' death reveals the complex emotions that his end evoked even among his enemies. Pompey, upon receiving word of the king's demise, reportedly expressed both relief and a grudging respect for his longtime adversary. The Roman general understood that he had been denied the glory of personally defeating one of Rome's most formidable enemies, but he also recognized that Mithridates' suicide attempt and its horrific failure carried a symbolic weight that might actually serve Roman interests better than a formal execution. The image of the great Poison King undone by his own preparations would resonate throughout the ancient world as an example of the ultimate futility of resisting Roman power. The treatment of Mithridates' body after his death demonstrated the complex relationship between respect and political necessity that characterized Roman attitudes toward worthy enemies. Rather than subjecting the corpse to the usual indignities inflicted on defeated rebels, Pompey ordered that the king be given burial in the royal tombs at Sinope alongside his ancestors. This decision reflected both practical politics, demonstrating Roman magnanimity to potentially rebellious subjects, and a genuine recognition of Mithridates' stature as an opponent. The man who had feared his body would be degraded after death was instead honored with the traditional burial of Pontic royalty. The broader political consequences of Mithridates' death extended far beyond the borders of Pontus. His demise marked the effective end of serious Hellenistic resistance to Roman expansion in the East, closing a chapter that had begun with Alexander the Great's conquest centuries earlier. The kingdoms that had once challenged Rome's growing power were now either incorporated into the empire or reduced to client states. Mithridates had represented the last realistic hope for an independent Eastern power capable of matching Roman military and organizational capabilities. His death signaled to the remaining independent rulers that accommodation with Rome was no longer optional but essential for survival. The psychological impact of Mithridates' death on contemporary observers was perhaps more significant than its immediate political consequences. The story of his failed suicide spread rapidly throughout the ancient world, carried by merchants, soldiers, and diplomats who recognized its symbolic importance. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive preparation and the unpredictable nature of fate. The man who had seemingly thought of everything had been undone by his own thoroughness, creating a narrative that would resonate with anyone who had ever wondered whether their own precautions might someday prove counterproductive. The medical and scientific legacy of Mithridates' death would influence thinking about poison immunity for centuries to come. Ancient physicians studying his case began to understand some of the limitations of the immunity-building approach that had made him famous. While controlled exposure to toxins could indeed provide protection against specific substances, the same adaptations that created immunity could also prevent the therapeutic use of those substances when needed. This insight would prove valuable for later medical practitioners, though the full implications would not be understood until the development of modern pharmacology and toxicology. The cultural memory of Mithridates' death evolved over time, often emphasizing different aspects of the story depending on the political and social context of the telling. Roman historians tended to focus on the king's ultimate defeat and the triumph of Roman virtue over Eastern cunning. Greek writers often emphasized the tragic elements of the story, seeing in Mithridates' end a reflection of the broader decline of Hellenistic civilization. Later medieval and Renaissance authors would be particularly fascinated by the scientific aspects of his poison immunity program, viewing him as an early example of the learned prince who combined political power with scholarly investigation. The philosophical implications of Mithridates' death continue to provoke discussion long after the political circumstances that created it have been forgotten. His story raised profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, the unintended consequences of rational planning, and the ways in which our preparations for danger might themselves become sources of vulnerability. The king, who had devoted his life to mastering the art of survival, had discovered that mastery itself could become a form of imprisonment, trapping him in patterns of behavior that no longer served his needs. When circumstances changed, the transformation of Mithridates' personal tragedy into a broader historical symbol began almost immediately after his death. As both Roman and Greek writers recognized the narrative power of his story, Pompey himself appears to have understood the propaganda value of the tale, ensuring that accounts of the king's failed suicide were widely circulated throughout the empire. The image of Rome's enemy undone by his own excessive cleverness served to reinforce Roman claims about the superiority of their straightforward military approach over the supposedly decadent and over-complicated strategies of Eastern rulers. Yet even Roman accounts could not entirely suppress the tragic dignity of Mithridates' end, and many contemporary observers found themselves moved by his suffering despite their political loyalties. The immediate impact on medical practice in the ancient world was both significant and somewhat ironic. While Mithridates' death had revealed the limitations of his immunity approach, it also sparked renewed interest in toxicology and antidote development among physicians throughout the Mediterranean. Ancient doctors began attempting to recreate his universal antidote, leading to the development of compounds called Mithridateum that would remain standard treatments for poisoning well into the medieval period. These preparations typically contained dozens of ingredients and were marketed as providing the same broad-spectrum protection that had made famous, though few practitioners understood the specific mechanisms involved or the potential drawbacks of such an approach. The influence of Mithridates' death on later political figures was profound and long-lasting. Rulers throughout history would study his example, though they drew different lessons from his experience. Some saw his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive preparation and paranoia, while others focused on the importance of maintaining multiple escape options rather than relying on a single method. The Roman Emperor Nero, facing his own forced suicide centuries later, reportedly worried that he might face similar difficulties and made arrangements for multiple means of self-destruction. Even in more recent times, political leaders have referenced Mithridates when discussing the balance between security measures and personal freedom. The literary and artistic legacy of Mithridates' death proved remarkably durable, inspiring works across multiple cultures and centuries. Jean Raison's 1673 tragedy Mithridates transformed the historical account into a meditation on love, betrayal, and the corrupting effects of power. Though it took considerable liberties with the actual events, Mozart's early opera Mithridates Riaponto used the story as a vehicle for exploring themes of family loyalty and political responsibility. These artistic interpretations often emphasize different aspects of the tale, some focusing on the political dimensions, others on the personal tragedy, and still others on the ironic reversal of fortune that made the story so compelling. The scientific and medical establishment's engagement with Mithridates' legacy evolved significantly over time as understanding of toxicology and immunology advanced. Medieval physicians often took the historical accounts at face value, assuming that the king had indeed achieved broad immunity to all poisons and attempting to recreate his methods. Renaissance, medical writers began to question some aspects of the traditional story, recognizing that complete immunity to all toxins was probably impossible given the variety of mechanisms by which different poisons operate. Modern toxicologists understand that while specific immunities can indeed be developed through controlled exposure, the kind of universal protection attributed to Mithridates was likely exaggerated by ancient sources. The psychological and philosophical implications of Mithridates' death continue to generate discussion among scholars and thinkers throughout the medieval and modern periods. His story was frequently cited in discussions about the relationship between reason and emotion, the limits of human planning, and the ways in which our attempts to control fate might ultimately be self-defeating. Renaissance humanists saw in his death an example of the tragic hero undone by his own virtues. His intelligence, preparation, and foresight had become the instruments of his destruction. Enlightenment thinkers used his example to explore questions about scientific methodology and the unintended consequences of technological advancement. The military and strategic lessons drawn from Mithridates' career and death influenced tactical thinking for centuries. Though different analysts emphasize different aspects of his experience, some military theorists focused on his innovative use of toxicology as a form of personal protection, seeing it as an early example of the application of scientific knowledge to military problems. Others emphasized the political dimensions of his downfall, arguing that his excessive focus on personal security had prevented him from maintaining the loyalty of his subjects and family members. Modern strategic analysts have noted parallels between his approach and contemporary concerns about the balance between security measures and operational effectiveness. The story of Mithridates VI forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of preparation, security, and the unintended consequences of our attempts to control dangerous forces. In our modern world, where we face unprecedented technological capabilities for both protection and destruction, his experience carries particular relevance. The king who made himself immune to poison provides a haunting metaphor for the ways in which our safety measures might themselves become sources of vulnerability, trapping us in systems of our own creation that no longer serve their original purposes when circumstances change dramatically. The psychological dimensions of Mithridates' final hours reveal something profound about the human condition under extreme stress. Here was a man who had devoted his entire adult life to a single, overriding goal, protecting himself from a specific form of death, only to discover in his moment of greatest need that his protection had become his prison. The methodical scientific approach that had served him so well throughout his career became the source of his ultimate torment. This transformation of strength into weakness, of rational preparation into irrational obstacle, speaks to deep fears about the reliability of human planning and the possibility that our greatest achievements might somehow be turned against us. The broader historical significance of Mithridates' death extends beyond the immediate political consequences to encompass fundamental questions about power, knowledge, and the relationship between the individual and the forces of history. His story represents the end of an era in which individual rulers could realistically hope to challenge the growing power of organized states through personal excellence and innovative thinking. The age of the heroic king, exemplified by figures like Alexander the Great and Hannibal, was giving way to a new period in which success would depend more on institutional strength and collective action than on individual genius or preparation. The moral dimensions of Mithridates' story resist easy categorization, forcing us to grapple with the complex relationship between sympathy and judgment when evaluating historical figures. His methods were often brutal, He used condemned criminals as test subjects for his poison experiments and orchestrated the massacre of thousands of Roman civilians. Yet his final suffering evokes genuine pathos. The man, who had inflicted so much pain on others, experienced a form of psychological torment that seems almost designed to balance the scales of cosmic justice. This moral ambiguity makes his story more compelling and more disturbing than simpler tales of good defeating evil. The scientific legacy of Mithridates continues to influence modern thinking about immunity, adaptation, and the unintended consequences of medical intervention. Contemporary researchers studying drug resistance, vaccine development, and the long-term effects of pharmaceutical treatments often reference his example when discussing the complex relationships between exposure, adaptation, and therapeutic effectiveness. His story serves as a reminder that biological systems are often more complex than they initially appear, and that interventions designed to provide protection can sometimes create new forms of vulnerability that only become apparent under extreme conditions. The cultural impact of Mithridates' death has proven remarkably persistent, continuing to inspire new interpretations and applications across diverse fields of human endeavor. Political scientists study his example when analyzing the relationship between personal security and political effectiveness. Psychologists reference his story when discussing the potential negative consequences of excessive preparation and control-seeking behavior. Business strategists use his case as an example of how competitive advantages can become competitive disadvantages when market conditions change rapidly. The ultimate horror of Mithridates' death lies not in any external torture or degradation, but in the revelation that our most carefully constructed defenses can become the instruments of our own suffering. In an age when we face unprecedented challenges requiring unprecedented responses, his story serves as both warning and inspiration, warning us about the potential costs of excessive preparation while inspiring us to think more creatively about the complex relationships between protection and vulnerability, between strength and weakness, between the measures we take to preserve ourselves and the selves we are trying to preserve. His legacy compels us to ask whether true security lies in building ever stronger defenses or in maintaining the flexibility to adapt when our defenses prove inadequate. The poisoned King of Pontus, trapped in his final moments by the very immunity that had protected him for decades, reminds us that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in being prepared for everything, but in being prepared to abandon our preparations when they no longer serve us. In death, Mithridates VI achieved a kind of immortality he never sought, not as the victorious king he had hoped to be, but as an eternal symbol of the terrible irony that can emerge when human intelligence and human limitation collide in the most profound and personal way possible.